Hello again to Other Agricolor Reacts, and today we will be watching another part of World War II, Part X, Warsaw Ghetto Uprising from Dr. Roy Casagranda from the Austin School. The first part was 2 weeks ago. I know I'm looking exactly the same. I'm just doing that in the same time because I just want to know. I found it that when I was doing the reaction to his longer video about how Islam saved the Western civilization, and I was recording every 2 weeks, like I was uploading, I just often would forget what he was talking in before, or it's just too many happening between those 2 weeks. So I think this way it's gonna be easier for me to know what he was like talking about and assuming and basically alluding. I'm missing a word here now, what I was trying to use. Basically what he was mentioning, that would be a good word, isn't it? Mentioning earlier on. So let's just jump into it. And I'm gonna set the timer for 20 minutes again. And let's go.
Lunch with them and we talk. And I like to talk culture with them. So finally one day I said, I'm ready to ask you this difficult question. And they go, okay. So 200 years ago, when your ancestors went, we're Greek, how did they know they weren't Turks? And they both burst into laughter. They're both PhDs, they're both professors, they study culture. Right? They burst into laughter and they go, they didn't. And I go, then what happened? They go, they just picked. They just went, we're Greek, done. Boom. It's that simple. But by saying we're Greek, what they were also saying, and this was just as important, is we're not Turk. That line land. That line was an arbitrary land in many cases. And when the Ottoman Empire finally ceased to exist, there were communities of Greeks living in what is today Turkey, and there were communities of Turks in what is today Greece. And like the Indian partition, they got up and swapped places. And it wasn't exactly peaceful. There was a lot of violence in this process. But in many cases, they had to pick. They had to sit down and go, I actually don't know what I am. But when you're a nationalist, you can easily define what you are by what you're not. So Germany found itself in that weird situation where the nationalists were trying to figure out how to have an other that they could hate, another they could contrast themselves against, right? Let me give you an example. It's going to get me in trouble with people, but I like to get in trouble, so I'm okay with it. Which is more identity erasing? Being forced to cover your hair or changing your last name when you get married? It seems to me losing your name is way worse than wearing a hat when it comes time to eliminating a person's identity. Everybody I know in the United States changed their name when they got married, except for like 2 or 3 people. So for me, it's like 90-something%. Why? Did your DNA change? Are you now related to that guy? That's weird. Isn't that incest? I think that's wrong. Did you really get sucked into that family? We'll see during your divorce if that's true or not. I bet it ain't. I actually know of cases where the divorced person ended up closer to the family than the kid that was actually related. So it's possible. I'm not ruling it out. Just saying, probably against, it's stacked against that as the outcome. Now, don't get me wrong. I think forcing anybody to cover their hair is also wrong. I think forcing people to anything is wrong. You should let people come to it on their own. But I'm just asking the question. Because when we talk about hijab, we immediately villainize the hell out of the Middle East. Yet we're not looking at our own sexism and our own identity-crushing events. Arab women don't change their name when they get married. Because that would be weird. That would be an identity-crushing event. So one of the things that we do with American nationalism is we're like, they're sexist. Our women are liberated. Are you? At the current rate, by the way, of gender pay equality, Saudi Arabia will hit gender equality by the year 2100, the United States will hit it by 2200. They will beat us by a century. Saudi Arabia, you know the country you like to villainize all the time for being so sexist, will have gender pay equality a full century before us. At the end of the day, let's face it, monetary power is power. Do you see what I'm saying? One of the things that we love to do, what nationalists love to do, is mask their flaws by finding flaws in others and go, well, at least we're not that. How many times have you been in a conversation with somebody and you brought up something the United States did that was wrong? So for example, genocide of Native Americans. And they go, well, but in World War II, the Nazis.
It's the same
Really?
thing.
You're comparing us to the Nazis? That's where you went to? Like you didn't want to go for, I don't know, Britain first or something, or France, or just something a little gentler?
Genocide is genocide, isn't
the
it?
British were gentler than the Nazis,
No.
just for the record.
Yeah.
But in the public perception, there's that false belief. Anyway, so that's what nationalists do. Here are these German nationalists, and they decided they were going to go for Judenhass. Judenhass means Jew hatred. Judenhass. But as they were expanding upon Judenhass, coming up with reasons to hate Jews, they already had a list. And then they had a history. And the history was the history of pogroms. So the first pogrom was 1096. What happened was the Crusader army, before it left Germany to go to the Middle East to tear it up and kill 1 million people over the course of 195 years, before that Crusader army took off, it decided it needed Jesus' blessings right there in Germany. So that Crusader army went up and down the Rhine River looking for Jewish communities. The estimate is that they murdered about 9,000 Jews. They raped thousands of Jewish women, and then they set off to the Middle East, where they would then slaughter Muslims and Jews wholesale, time after time after time. But they needed to get it started. And they started it with a pogrom. So by the time we get to the 19th century, we've got 800 years of pogrom history. Because anytime anything went wrong in Europe, the European political leaders would go, the Jews. There's high inflation, the Jews, they did it. There was an earthquake, that was also Jewish. The Jews made the earthquake happen. And so the next thing you know, there's a pogrom where the people in the community would just go to the Jewish part of town and beat up some Jews for a while or kill them, and then vent their anger, and then the politicians would go, thank you. But it's the politicians that needed to be beaten up. That was well, not the earthquake, but certainly the inflation was their fault, and this was a way to deflect. So by the time we get to the end of the 19th century, those German nationalists are building on that, but they had a problem. Judenhass, Jew hatred. Sounds awful. Who wants that? It's an emotional thing. Hate. That's not rational. Rational people don't hate. Rational things. There's no such thing as rationality, just for a record. Funny though. We rationalize. After we've made a decision, we come up with a crazy story that tries to make sense out of the irrational decision we made.
Oh wow, that actually, yeah. That is so true.
But
where's my thing? Yeah, it's working. Okay. That's so true, isn't it? We rationalize after the fact. Huh.
Same as rationality. So, they didn't like the term because it sounded too emotional. So they decided to come up with a new term, a term that would sound scientific. And the term they came up with was anti-Semitism. So Semites and Hamites are cultural linguistic groups. They were named after Sem and Ham, or Shem and Ham, depending on how you're saying it, the two of Noah's sons. The Semites were the Asian group, the Hamites were the African group. So the ancient Egyptians, the Berbers, the Ethiopians, the Somalis, they're Hamites. So think of the indigenous North African population. Arabs, Jews, the Aramaic speakers, so like the Babylonians, Canaanites, Moabites, those populations, those were the Semites. And so when the Germans picked the term, the German practitioners of Judenhaus picked the term anti-Semitism, they actually included Arabs in the process because Arabs are Semites. Hebrew and Arabic are shockingly similar languages. They're very closely related. I don't think they're quite as closely related as Aramaic is to Hebrew, but they're very close. And so at that moment, there was this cultural inclusion, I think, that the German nationalists didn't necessarily intend to include, but at some level they did. Because here's one of the interesting things. All this anti-Jewish hate was intimately tied to anti-Muslim hate. This wasn't separated out nicely and neatly. For example, in Spain, Judaism was banned in Spain in 1492, a year that a bunch of stuff happened at the same time. 1492 is a huge year. It also happens to be the year that the Kingdom of Granada fell to Castile and Leon, to Isabella. That's why Judaism was outlawed in that year. Because as long as there was a Muslim-controlled territory in Spain, there was a place for Jews to flee to. There was a place to defend the Jews. So what the Christian fundamentalist fanatics who were making Spain needed to do was take out the last Muslim state before they could start to purge the peninsula of its Jewish population. Well, in other words, going after the Jewish population in Spain required you first to put down the last Muslim state. And then, 10 years later, Islam was banned. So when the Spanish Inquisition gets implemented, here's the ironic twist. People will say, you know, how many Jews, how many Muslims were killed in the Spanish Inquisition? The answer is 0. Because the Inquisition only had the authority to determine whether or not Christians were practicing Christianity correctly. The people who were killed that you mean are Jewish and Muslim were Jewish and Muslim converts to the Catholic faith. The conversos were Jewish converts to Catholicism. The Moriscos were the Muslim converts to Catholicism. That's what the Inquisition went after. And then it would show that secretly, oh, that person is still a Jew in their household. I'm so sorry, we're gonna have to burn you to death. That's right, that's what Jesus would want for you right now.
Yeah,
And it's our way of saving your soul. Oh, this person's secretly Muslim. Okay, we're gonna have to come up with a really crazy way to kill you. How about the spike? We'll spike you on a wall slowly, so you die over a course of a few days. That way, when you arrive at the pearly gates and you're judged, the heaven will go, you've already suffered so much, we don't need you to burn in hell. Wasn't that kind of those priests? It's very kind, very thoughtful. They weren't torturing you to be cruel to you. They were torturing you to try to save yourself.
Yeah.
It's very kind.
Get to this, that heaven gates and all that. Jesus Christ, never heard about it. See, this is what I'm talking about. A lot of information from this man.
To keep it in Spain for just a second, there's another twist. Our colorism comes out of this moment as well. In other words, not only is anti-Jewish hatred linked intimately to anti-Muslim hatred, but so is anti-black racism. Because this new fundamentalist Christian state that's become Spain has to figure out how it establishes the hierarchy. And in its mind, the hierarchy is that you're pure Christian or purer Christian, unless you have fewer Muslim ancestors, fewer Jewish ancestors. So what they concluded was, the lighter your skin color, the purer Christian ancestry you had, the darker your skin color, the more Muslim and Jewish ancestry you had.
Wow.
And that's where the term white came from, with whiteness being your aspired goal. You wanted to die so that you could be really white. Right? If you've ever seen a dead white person, they're really, really, really white. That's your goal. Because then at that moment, you've proven to everybody you have very little Jewish and Muslim ancestry. So in that moment, then, Europe has this race thing that it's just concocted. Now, for sure, there was always something like a bias towards a group, but it was never framed that way. This is a new thing that pops up. So in this moment, there are these moving parts, but there's something else that's going on at the same time. And that is that the way that we see history is reframed. So there's a guy named Hieronymus Wolff. So I can't believe I Americanized it. Hieronymus Wolff. Anyway, I said Wolff. I'm so embarrassed. Hieronymus Wolff. What he did was, it drove him nuts how the Roman Empire collapsed. The Roman Empire fell May 29, 1453, to the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was Muslim. So the Roman
14,
Empire died just
I'm so confused
a couple
about
of decades before Columbus sails the ocean blue to a Muslim empire. It drove him nuts. It drove Europeans nuts. At some level, they didn't care anymore. The Roman Empire was like this thing. It was like this wound. But at another level, it was this thing that white men, especially Christian white men, are super crazy obsessed with. And for centuries, it isn't just a recent phenomenon on TikTok, but it is also that now too. It's this thing that's been around forever. And so there was this wound, this festering, painful reminder of the glory of that Rome was no longer, that gets put down by this Muslim empire. And so what Hieronymus Wolff does, he comes up with a clever scam. He's going to trick the world. On September 4, 476 AD, the emperor Romulus Augustus, the Western Roman emperor, took off his robes, his purple robes, put it in a box, called in FedEx, had FedEx ship it to Constantinople, and with a note. And it said, there's no point in having two Roman emperors, Emperor Zeno. Why don't you be the only Roman emperor? So then what happens is Hieronymus Wolff goes, that's the moment the Roman Empire fell. The moment that it went from two emperors to one. It didn't fall. It just deleted one of its emperors, and now it has a single emperor, and then it changed its flag a few decades later to a two-headed eagle, because it's one empire with two heads, because it's West and East combined. So the Roman Empire didn't fall, but then that way, he could take credit for the Roman Empire falling, because he could say the Germanic tribesmen did it. Odovacar did it. It was actually a Goth. Oh, that's so cool. The Goths did it. They put on the makeup, they got put on black clothes, and the next thing you know, Rome fell. It was very sad, very sad. That's why the weeping and the kind of always sad look that the Goths today have. Just, no, it's not funny. Just feel like it is. I'm pretty sure it's funny. So, and then that way, the last 1,000 years of Roman history that ends in a Muslim defeat for the Roman Empire, Muslim victory over the Roman Empire, a defeat at the hands of Muslims, was the Byzantine Empire. He repackaged it. The Romans never called themselves the Byzantines. He made it up. These pieces are all combined together in a really weird way to create a new narrative. A narrative that Europe was always on top. Europe was always great. It was Europeans who took out the Romans, not those terrible Muslim Middle Easterners who took out the Romans. In fact, when you think about it, it's really amazing. How is Anatolia not in Western civilization? How is Iraq and Egypt not in Western civilization? Those are the places where it was founded. Syria, that's where Western civilization was born. So if anything, what the Europeans do is they pretend that they imported it, but they're the genuine thing. How can you be the genuine thing when you imported it? It would be like taking something made in China and stamping made in America on it and turning around and selling it to somebody. It's not right. It's still made in China. You just stamp made in USA on it. All right. So these are the pieces that are coming together in like the 1890s. Anti-Semitism, Judenhass, anti-Muslim hate, the racism that Europeans have been implementing first in the Americas, then in Africa, then in Asia, the colonial process, the fact that the Rudyard Kipling's idea of the white man's burden, that Christian white Europeans were going to these savage, barbaric lands and teaching them civilization, that these were backwards people. Maybe they weren't terrible people. Maybe their culture could eventually evolve and flower into something else. But they were just so backwards, they needed a boost. And that's the role of the white man's burden. Of course, Rudyard Kipling then made another poem later, because he made all these poems, one of them, The White Man's Burden, which glorified the British Empire. And then World War I happens and his son dies in battle. And so then he writes a poem where he says, their fathers lied and then they died. And in other words, he reevaluated the stupidity of what he was saying in his original poetry. That's his real power, not his original poetry. It's the shock and dismay that he told these really bizarre lies. His kid bought it and died for it. So, in the midst of all of this, it became really easy for the Germans to have this imaginary idea of what the Jews were, the German nationalists, to have this imaginary idea of what Jews were, and then build on that, and villainize them, and talk about how horrible they were, time after time after time. And anytime anything went wrong or you didn't like something, you'd blame it on them. Oh, Marx was a Jew. Technically, he had Jewish ancestry, but his parents converted to Christianity. He was actually raised as a Christian. They didn't care. He had Jewish culture, Jewish DNA. Because eventually, throw in Darwin now, and there's a new layer added to this mix. Well, if my nation is superior,
how are we? Oh, yeah.
and then we throw in Darwin, and Darwin's about survival of the fittest, then doesn't it only seem right that we should become selective about the types of DNA that we allow to exist in our nation?
I guess that's
doesn't
what
it
people
seem
do.
selective
Okay.
then that we should actively seek to get rid of the weaklings? In 1901,
I just can't
the
find
United
a
States
proper
becomes the
place
first
to stop.
place to start implementing eugenics laws. The state of Indiana.
Okay, he kind of veered off again. So basically, yeah, so far about the racism and stuff, and the fact that all those Spanish Inquisition, yeah, I always heard they were just going after Sure, I didn't really look that much into Inquisition, so I wouldn't really know that much about it, but I always was taught about like Muslims and stuff like that, so but yeah, so there was no openly Muslim people there anyway, so everything was hidden. I always was, since a kid, I was just thinking that, it was, I actually don't know what I was thinking. Anyway, so this is part 2 of World War II Part X, Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. We're in 42 minutes and we can barely hear about Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Just in the beginning to think about, he said he had to put some groundwork on why Nazis were as they were, which actually explains a lot to me as well. Because it doesn't take just like a few years or even a few decades to just nation become how they became. And it takes a really long time. So basically now I'm gonna finish here and we'll see continuation of this part 3 in 2 weeks time, and for the regular schedule tomorrow as always. And thank you very much for watching. Bye.